Hey everyone, and welcome to 8 Minute Equity, a video series from Ledgy, where we unpack an interesting equity topic in around 8 minutes. At this time, you join us for a conversation on remuneration committees and to what extent the remuneration committee connects with equity. I'm Joe, I'm content and communications lead at Ledgy, and today I'm delighted to be joined by Dan Harris from PwC. Dan has a lot of experience advising remuneration committees or REMCOs in private and publicly listed businesses. Dan, it's great to have you with us today.
Thanks, Joe. Good to be here.
Yeah, so I think remuneration committees will be pretty familiar to our audience, at least in the abstract, but there are definitely a few questions we hear at Ledgy from customers and other scaling businesses. The first is, I'm a relatively early stage business and I don't really have a remuneration committee in any official form. So when should I think about establishing a formal remuneration committee? And actually, how does that remuneration committee look and feel as over time as the business evolves?
Sure. Yeah, no, good question. I mean, I think the reality is that what we see in a lot of cases is that it'll be external money coming in, investment into the business that is often the driver for that discussion in terms of the level of formality, in terms of properly forming a remuneration committee formally, and that's often in the investment agreement. It's basically a condition that the remuneration committee will be set up. And I guess within that, what you're finding there is probably some high level terms of reference as to how they would operate in terms of the key things that the remuneration committee will have remit over. And ultimately, these things are really a driver for transparency of process. So whether, how things are allocated and at what point, that's the kind of the key driver. And as a business matures, I think the level of formality will then grow. But, all coming from a place, I guess, of, if in the nicest way, external people putting the money in and wanting a bit of level of justification and governance so they can see how that is being deployed within the business, particularly in terms of equity, which is obviously the key driver in terms of alignment with them.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it would be a great jumping off point maybe to get into our next topic, which really is how deep in the weeds can and should the REMCO get on equity. I think, we hear a lot about remuneration committees, adjudicating on the LTIP for the CEO in a public company maybe. But, if it's a private company, maybe, and when you're talking about equity grants, to what extent is it arm's length or quite hands-on?
Sure. I think, look, it's fair to say different investors will have different approaches. That's the first thing to say here. So there's not necessarily a one size fits all. But equally, when we think about actually equity and therefore dilution that brings, often that is a conversation that you'll see upfront in terms of when someone's putting the money in, being really clear on what's the size of the equity pot available. And I think that's the key piece. And obviously, as a business and as founders, they really need to get comfortable with that in terms of, okay, what have I got to play with going forward in terms of incentivizing my key individuals. Then I think in terms of how that will operate going forward, often there'll be an active conversation as to, well, okay, we've now got this pot, that's sort of set in stone, but in terms of allocation, how is that deployed? As I say, that would kind of be a live debate, and actually quite a healthy one, because I think investors will see that elsewhere in their other investments, obviously generally have a lot more experience, and therefore kind of the challenge created through that as to who that should go to and the real value drivers, because at the end of the day, there's only so much equity to go around is a key debate.
And I suppose an interesting, almost philosophical question here is, in whose interests does the REMCO serve? If there's a new funding round where there are a new share class created or liquidation preferences, should the REMCO by default operate in the interests of all stakeholders in the abstract, or the founder, or the existing investors? How do they tend to approach those decisions?
Yeah, I mean, I think again, the deal dynamics will often dictate how that's kind of operated. But when we really think about that, I think you always have to be cognizant of people wearing a few multiple hats in those conversations. That's the reality. Sure. And in particular, earlier stage businesses, the reality will be that the Remco members are often investors.
Yeah.
And so they'll be thinking about it in that context and therefore representing ultimately their investors themselves. So I think that's really important. And as founders and as management members, I think you always have to put yourselves a little bit and try and put yourself in their shoes quite often to try and understand the perspectives they'll be coming from and almost their shareholder experience to date so that you can kind of gauge where they might be on that. I always say this, I mean, I think in terms of, there's a technical piece in terms of allocations and how that's actually done. But the success or failure of a good working remuneration committee is really around stakeholder management, and founders, kind of need to work at that as much as anything else outside the room rather than inside.
And it's always a bit of a reciprocal exercise, isn't it? Where founders put themselves in the shoes of investors in these kind of negotiations and vice versa. So just to sum up, really, how would you say a private early stage remuneration committee, what are the sort of key signifiers that would tell you this business is using the Remco in the right way? It's ready to enable the company to scale.
As I say, I mean, I think for me that a good healthy debate around equity allocations, how that's working, is a good sign. Having everyone, ultimately these things about having alignment, so having everyone aligned to what you're doing, bought in, but kind of educating people as you go. So why new hires are really crucial to the growth of the business, and therefore why the equity allocations are important is a really necessary job to do. So that communication piece, and as I say, the stakeholder management by founders to get the Remco up the curve, because obviously they're not in that business day to day, is the key thing, I think, to a successful Remco and working practices.
Brilliant. Dan, it was fantastic to chat with you. Loads of insights and lessons for people on remuneration committees. Great to talk with you.
Thank you for having me.
You've been watching 8 Minute Equity. To learn more about making equity work for your company, just head to ledgy.com. Thanks, everyone.